12 years ago, an old man saved a dying elephant and watched it disappear into the wild, believing their story had ended forever. But on a cold, mist-heavy morning, the earth began to vibrate beneath his feet. When he opened his door, the past was standing in his yard. The elephant had returned, older, larger, silent, and when it finally lowered its trunk, it dropped something into the dirt that made his hands start to shake. But before I tell you what the elephant brought back, comment your country below. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let me take you back to the day their lives first crossed. Dawn arrived quietly over the small countryside, the kind of morning that usually passed without memory. Pale light stretching slowly across the fields, a thin ribbon of mist hovering just above the earth, and the distant call of waking birds drifting lazily through the cool air. Nothing about that morning suggested it would be different from the thousands that had come before it. Inside a modest wooden house at the edge of the village, an old man named Elias stood near his kitchen window, wrapping his weathered hands around a chipped ceramic mug, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. Age had slowed him, but it had also taught him to appreciate these silent moments, the way the fog softened the hills, the way the world seemed gentler before the noise of day fully arrived. For years, his life had followed this same peaceful rhythm, untouched by urgency, untouched by surprise. But then, the cup trembled slightly in his grip. At first, he thought it was just his hands. They were not as steady as they once were. Yet when he set the mug down, he noticed something else. The spoons hanging beside the stove began to clink softly together. A loose window latch rattled once, then again. Elias frowned. The air itself felt different, as if the morning had paused mid-breath. Outside, the birds that normally scattered across his yard lifted suddenly into the sky in a restless swirl, abandoning the trees all at once. Even the village dogs, creatures that barked at nothing and everything, fell into an uneasy silence. Elias stepped onto his porch, the wooden boards creaking beneath his weight, and listened. That was when he felt it, not a sound exactly, but a sensation traveling upward through the soles of his boots. A faint vibration, slow, heavy, rhythmic, the kind that did not belong to wind or passing trucks or distant thunder. Something large was moving, very large. He narrowed his eyes toward the open fields, but the mist was thick there, drifting in long, ghost-like curtains that concealed more than they revealed. For a moment he considered dismissing it, telling himself the world was full of harmless explanations. Yet the vibration grew stronger, deliberate, accompanied now by a low, almost imperceptible tremor in the ground that made the surface of a nearby water trough ripple gently. Then, from within the fog, a shape began to form. At first no more than a darker shadow pressing against the whiteness. Elias leaned forward slightly, his breath slowing, a strange tension tightening across his chest. Shapes did not simply appear out here, not like this. The shadow moved with purpose, each step measured, unhurried, impossibly heavy. And as it drew closer, the mist curled and parted around it, revealing the towering outline of something his mind struggled to accept, even while his eyes confirmed it. An elephant, alone, walking straight toward his house. For a long second, Elias did not move. He did not call out, he did not step back. His body seemed caught somewhere between disbelief and recognition, because beneath the astonishment, beneath the sheer impossibility of seeing such a creature emerging from the pale morning, another realization was rising quietly, powerfully, like a memory waking from a deep sleep. There was something familiar in the way it carried itself, something hauntingly known in the steady rhythm of its approach. The animal was enormous, far larger than any he remembered, its skin marked by the long artistry of time, its tusks worn but formidable, its presence commanding enough to make the world feel suddenly smaller around it. Yet it showed no sign of agitation, no wild uncertainty. It walked with calm intention, its gaze fixed ahead as if it had already chosen its destination long before this morning began. Elias felt his heartbeat quicken, not from fear, but from the overwhelming sensation that the past was no longer behind him. 12 years earlier, on a storm-torn afternoon that most of the village had forgotten, a younger version of himself had stood on a muddy roadside, staring down at a creature fighting for its life. He had not known then that a single decision, one step forward when everyone else stepped back, would bind his story to that animal forever. He had never expected to see it again, never allowed himself to imagine that somewhere beyond the forests and rivers, beyond the slow turning of seasons, the elephant might still carry the memory of the man who refused to abandon it. Yet now, as the distance between them closed, Elias noticed a faint scar tracing along the elephant's front leg, weathered, stretched with growth, but unmistakable. His breath caught. Time folded in on itself. This was not coincidence. This was not wandering chance. Somehow, after 12 silent years, it had found its way back. The elephant stopped a few yards from the fence, studying him with an intelligence so steady it was almost unsettling. The world seemed to shrink into that single shared gaze, man and animal regarding one another across the fragile bridge of memory. Elias became aware that his hands were trembling again, though he could not say whether it was age or the quiet shock pressing through him. "Is it really you?" he whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. The elephant's ears shifted gently, and it took another step forward, the fence offering no real barrier to a creature of such strength, yet it made no move to break it. Instead, it lowered its massive head slightly, and in that motion there was something profoundly familiar. Not submission, not dominance, but recognition, as if no time had passed at all. 1,000 questions rushed through Elias's mind, colliding with one another. Why had it come? How had it remembered? What invisible map had guided it across such distance? But before any answer could begin to take shape, the elephant lifted its trunk slowly, deliberately, and Elias noticed for the first time that it was holding something small compared to the enormity of the creature, yet gripped with astonishing care. Mud clung to it. Moisture dripped steadily onto the earth below. The elephant stepped closer, closer still, until Elias could hear the deep rumble of its breathing. Then, with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible for a being so powerful, it extended its trunk over the fence and released the object into the dust at his feet. Elias stared down at it, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears, a strange chill spreading across his skin despite the growing warmth of the sunrise. He had the overwhelming sense, the undeniable certainty, that whatever lay in the dirt before him was the reason this giant had returned, the reason the quiet of this ordinary morning had been shattered, the reason the past had walked out of the fog and into his life once more. Slowly, almost afraid of what his hands might confirm, Elias bent down toward the mud-covered object, unaware that the moment he was stepping into would change far more than just his own destiny, and that this unexpected reunion was only the beginning of a story no one in the village would ever forget. 12 years earlier, Elias had not yet learned how quickly an ordinary day could turn into the kind that follows a person for the rest of their life. Back then, his shoulders were broader, his stride firmer, and though the quiet kindness in his eyes was the same, time had not yet carved its gentle lines across his face. The storm had arrived without warning that afternoon, a violent, fast-moving wall of charcoal clouds that swallowed the sky and sent villagers rushing indoors. Rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud, while thunder rolled endlessly across the hills, like a warning no one could quite interpret. When the storm finally drifted onward hours later, the world it left behind looked battered and unfamiliar, branches scattered across the ground, fences half-toppled, and deep grooves cut into the roadside by rushing water. Elias had been walking back from the market when he first heard it, a sound so low and strained it nearly blended with the fading growl of thunder. At first, he thought it was the creaking of broken timber shifting in the wind, but then it came again. Longer this time, trembling with pain. He followed the sound beyond the road, down a slope where rainwater had carved a shallow ravine, and that was where he saw it. A young elephant lay collapsed on its side, its massive body streaked with mud, one front leg twisted awkwardly beneath it. A deep gash ran along the flesh near its shoulder, likely from debris hurled by the storm, or perhaps a frightened encounter during its attempt to flee the chaos. Flies had already begun to gather despite the rain-cooled air, and each breath the animal drew sounded like a fragile negotiation with exhaustion. Villagers stood at a distance, their voices tight with fear. Some urged Elias to step back, warning that a wounded wild animal was unpredictable, that getting close would be foolish. Others simply shook their heads, certain the creature would not survive the night. But Elias could not ignore the way the elephant's eye moved, alert despite the pain, watching the world with a quiet desperation that needed no translation. Compassion overruled caution. Slowly, speaking in a low, steady tone more for himself than the animal, he stepped forward. The elephant tried to stir at his approach, panic flickering through its gaze, but it lacked the strength to rise. Elias stopped a few feet away, letting the creature adjust to his presence. Rainwater dripped from his coat as he studied the wound, realizing that without help, infection alone would seal the animal's fate. He fetched water first, moving carefully, returning again and again until the mud thinned and the injury revealed itself clearly. Each time he came back, the elephant watched, tense at first, then gradually less so, as if sensing something unfamiliar yet reassuring in the man's patience. When Elias finally reached out, his hand hovered for a moment before touching the rough, rain-chilled skin. The reaction was immediate. The elephant stilled completely. No struggle, no frightened cry, just a long, trembling exhale that seemed to release the last of its resistance. In that silent exchange, beneath the clearing sky, an invisible thread tied their lives together. Though neither could have known how far into the future that single act of mercy would one day echo. Elias did not leave when the others did. As the last of the villagers drifted back toward their homes, convinced that nothing more could be done, he remained beside the fallen animal while the bruised sky slowly softened into evening. The storm clouds broke apart overhead, revealing thin streaks of fading gold, but down in the shallow ravine, the air still carried the heavy scent of wet earth and crushed grass. Up close, the elephant seemed even younger than he had first thought. Not a calf, but not yet fully grown either. Caught in that fragile space between strength and dependence, its sides rose and fell unevenly, each breath a visible effort. Elias understood that if the night claimed too much of the creature's strength, morning might never come for it. He worked with the quiet determination of someone who had already made his choice. Using strips torn from an old cloth sack, he cleaned the wound as thoroughly as he could, pouring water again and again until the diluted blood no longer ran dark through the mud. The gash was deep but mercifully free of lodged debris. Still, infection was a shadow that lingered close. He crushed medicinal leaves he knew from years of living close to the land, pressing them gently against the injury in hopes they might slow what he could not fully prevent. All the while he spoke, not in commands, not even in reassurance exactly, but in a calm, steady murmur, the kind one might use to soothe a frightened child. The words mattered less than the tone. Something in it seemed to reach the animal where logic could not. Night gathered gradually, bringing with it a vast, listening silence. Elias lit a small lantern and placed it nearby, its amber glow reflecting faintly in the elephant's dark eye. Several times the animal tried to rise, its muscles quivering with effort, only to sink back with a weary rumble that vibrated through the ground. Each attempt twisted something inside Elias, yet he never stepped away. Instead, he rested a hand against its shoulder whenever panic threatened to return, waiting until its breathing slowed again. Hours passed unnoticed. The stars emerged one by one, cold and watchful above them. Near midnight, a subtle shift occurred. The elephant's trunk moved uncertainly across the mud, searching, until it brushed against Elias's boot. He froze, unsure whether to pull back, but the trunk lingered there, tracing lightly as though memorizing the shape of his presence. Then, with surprising gentleness, it curled loosely around his wrist. Not tight, not restraining, simply holding. Elias felt the immense strength contained within that single, careful gesture, and with it came an overwhelming awareness of trust freely given. He did not speak then. Some moments were too complete for language. By dawn, the forest had begun to wake again, thin shafts of light filtering down into the ravine. Elias rose stiffly, his back protesting the long vigil, yet relief stirred within him when he saw a new alertness in the elephant's gaze. He coaxed it softly, stepping back to give it space. Muscles trembled, legs shifted, and after a long, suspended moment that seemed to stretch time itself, the elephant pushed upward. Once, faltered. Then again, with a low surge of effort that ended in sudden, miraculous balance, it stood. For several seconds, neither moved. The young giant swayed slightly, adjusting to gravity's demand, while Elias felt a quiet triumph spread through his chest. When the elephant finally took its first tentative step, the earth answered with a soft thud, steady and real. It turned toward him then, the morning light revealing the full depth of its dark, intelligent eye. Slowly, almost ceremonially, the trunk lifted and rested against his shoulder before sliding down to his hand, the very place it had held hours before. No fence separated them. No fear lingered between them, only a shared stillness that seemed to honor what they had endured together in a single night. Elias allowed himself a small breath of wonder. He understood, without needing to name it, that what had passed between them was not something time would easily erase, and though he could not yet know it, far beyond that clearing sky and the years waiting silently ahead, the memory forming in that moment was already beginning its long journey back to him. Morning unfolded gently across the valley, washing the storm's violence away with a fragile golden calm. Mist clung low to the ground, drifting lazily through the trees as if reluctant to leave the shelter of night. And for a while, Elias simply stood there, watching the elephant test its strength against the quiet earth. Each movement was cautious but determined, a creature relearning its own power after coming dangerously close to losing it. The wound would take time to heal fully, that much was certain, yet life had clearly returned to the animal's limbs, flowing again with steady insistence. For the next several days, Elias came back without fail. He brought water, armfuls of cut grass, fruit when he could spare it, and the same unwavering patience that had first convinced the frightened animal not to surrender to panic. Word spread through the village, of course. Some called him reckless, others stubborn, but gradually curiosity replaced fear. From a distance, people watched the unlikely companionship grow, the massive wild creature lowering its head slightly whenever Elias approached, the old farmer moving about with calm familiarity beside a being that could have crushed him without effort. Yet there was never even a hint of aggression. Trust, once planted, had taken root with astonishing depth. By the fourth morning, the change was undeniable. The elephant no longer leaned heavily on one side, no longer paused to gather strength after every step. Instead, it stood tall beneath the pale sky, ears shifting lazily in the breeze, its presence no longer that of a survivor, but of something meant to roam far horizons. Elias sensed the turning before it happened, that quiet, unspoken moment when help is no longer needed, when holding on becomes a form of selfishness. Healing, he understood, sometimes requires letting go. He approached slowly, not wanting the instant to feel abrupt. Up close, he could see that the rawness around the wound had softened, the angry swelling reduced to a faint reminder of what had nearly been lost. He rested his hand against the elephant's shoulder one last time, feeling the warmth beneath its thick skin, the steady rhythm of life moving confidently forward. "You're stronger now," he murmured, though the words were meant as much for his own heart as for the animal. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the elephant shifted its weight and turned toward the tree line where the forest waited, vast, green, and unknowable. It took several slow steps, then paused. The morning seemed to hold itself perfectly still. Even the leaves barely stirred. As if guided by some quiet instinct, the elephant looked back. Elias would remember that glance for the rest of his life. There was no fear in it, no confusion, only a deep, searching awareness, the kind that passes between beings who have shared something neither fully understands. Time stretched thin as they regarded one another across that small distance, man and animal suspended in a silence richer than any farewell words could have been. Elias felt an unexpected tightness in his chest, a gentle ache he hadn't prepared for. He had told himself this was always the goal, that wild things belong to the wild, yet knowing it did little to soften the quiet weight of goodbye. The elephant lifted its trunk then, releasing a low, resonant rumble that Elias felt more than heard, the vibration traveling softly through the air between them. It was not a cry of distress, nor a call for others. It sounded almost acknowledging. Then, with the unhurried certainty of something following its natural path, it turned away and walked toward the forest. Sunlight filtered through the branches ahead, catching along the curve of its back, until the brightness gradually swallowed its shape. Step by step, the enormous figure dissolved into green shadow, until at last there was nothing left but the whisper of disturbed leaves. Elias remained where he was, long after the elephant disappeared. The world resumed its motion around him, birds returning, insects humming, distant farm sounds rising once more. Yet he felt subtly altered, as though some invisible thread had been tied around his life and quietly pulled taut. Eventually he exhaled, a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, and made his way home. Years moved on, as years always do. Seasons painted the fields gold, then bare, then green again. The wound of that memory faded into something softer, a story he carried privately rather than spoke aloud. Sometimes, on particularly still mornings, he would catch himself looking toward the far edge of the forest, wondering where the great traveller had wandered, whether it still walked beneath distant suns. But such thoughts grew less frequent as time layered itself gently over the past, until, without warning, 12 silent years later, the ground began to tremble again. The present returned not with noise, but with a silence so unnatural it seemed to press against the ears. Elias remained bent over the mud-covered object for only a moment, before something deeper, older than thought, older even than memory, urged him to look up first. The elephant was still there, impossibly close now, its enormous frame rising like a living monument beyond the fence. Morning light had strengthened, dissolving the last threads of fog, and in that clearer glow he could see how time had shaped the animal just as surely as it had shaped him. The elephant was far larger than the young survivor he once knew, its body broad with maturity, its tusks long and weathered, its skin marked by faint pale lines that spoke of seasons endured. Yet the scar along its front leg remained, stretched and softened, but unmistakable, proof that the years between then and now had not been imagined. Elias straightened slowly, his heartbeat heavy and uneven. Awe mingled with something almost like disbelief, the kind that makes a person question whether they are fully awake. "You remembered," he whispered, though the words barely carried beyond his lips. The elephant's ears shifted forward at the sound of his voice, and it took one deliberate step closer. The fence creaked faintly as the animal's shadow spilled across it, but still it made no attempt to break through. Power restrained itself, strength choosing gentleness. That alone told Elias this was no wandering coincidence. The elephant had come with intention. By now, the quiet disturbance had begun to ripple outward through the village. A curtain twitched in a nearby window. Then another. One by one, doors opened cautiously, villagers stepping onto their porches with the hesitant curiosity people wear when confronted by something their minds struggle to explain. No one shouted, no one ran. The sheer calm of the elephant seemed to command a reverence that held panic at bay. Children peered from behind their parents' legs, eyes wide, while the older villagers exchanged stunned glances, searching each other's faces for confirmation that this was truly happening. But Elias saw none of them. His world had narrowed to the space between himself and the giant before him. The elephant lowered its head slightly, studying him with that same deep steadiness he remembered from long ago. Intelligence lived in that gaze. Not human, yet undeniably aware. For a fleeting instant, Elias felt as though the animal were measuring the years etched into his posture, noticing the slower way he moved, the silver that had overtaken his hair. Time recognizes time, he thought. Then the elephant's trunk rose again. Only now did Elias allow his attention to fall fully upon the object resting in the dirt near his boots. Up close, it looked smaller than it had from the porch, small enough to cradle in two hands. Mud clung thickly to its surface, dark and wet, as though it had been lifted from the edge of water. Something about the way it had been placed, not dropped carelessly, but set down with almost impossible precision, made the air feel charged with meaning. He crouched carefully, aware of the elephant watching his every movement. His knees protested the descent, yet he hardly noticed. With tentative fingers, he brushed away a layer of damp soil. More fell away with each gentle sweep, revealing faded fabric beneath. A strap, tiny eyelets. The curved outline became unmistakable before his mind allowed it to fully form. A child's shoe. Elias froze. For a moment he simply stared, his thoughts scattering like startled birds. A child's shoe had no place lying in the dust of his yard, delivered by a creature that had crossed untold distance to stand before him. Questions surged all at once. Where had it come from? Why bring it here? Where was the child who should have been wearing it? A faint tremor passed through his hands as he lifted the small shoe free from the mud. It was lighter than he expected, soaked but intact, its color dulled by dirt, yet still carrying the quiet innocence of something made for small, unsteady steps. When he turned it slightly, a thin scratch marked the side, fresh enough that it could not have weathered many seasons. Behind him, he sensed the villagers drawing nearer now, their whispers threading through the morning air, but he remained kneeling, caught in the gravity of what he held. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Elias raised his eyes toward the elephant once more. "Where did you find this?" he breathed. The elephant did not move away. Instead, it released a low rumble, deep and resonant, a sound that seemed less like a call and more like an urging. Then it turned its massive head toward the distant tree line, not fully stepping away, only angling its body as though pointing toward something unseen beyond the fields. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, like light spreading across water. This was not a gift, it was a message. And with a sudden tightening in his chest, Elias realized the elephant had not returned merely to close the circle of an old memory. It had come because somewhere out there, beyond the safety of the village, a story was still unfolding. One that had not yet reached its ending. For several suspended seconds, Elias could neither stand nor speak. The small shoe rested in his palm with an almost unbearable weight, though it could not have weighed more than a few ounces. Around him, the murmurs of the villagers grew into a low current of unease, but he heard them only distantly, as if the world itself had stepped back to give space to the realization forming inside him. Children do not simply lose their shoes in the wilderness, not without reason, not without danger. He rose slowly, his joints stiff, and looked again to the elephant. The great animal had already begun to turn, its massive body angling toward the open fields that stretched to the forest beyond. It did not walk away fully, instead it paused, glancing back just long enough to ensure he was watching, waiting. The intention was unmistakable now. It wanted him to follow. A ripple of tension moved through the villagers as Elias stepped toward the gate. Someone called his name in warning. Another urged him to wait for help. But urgency had already taken hold of him. 12 years ago, he had been the one to step forward when a life trembled on the edge. Today, something told him the elephant was asking the same courage of him again. "I think it's trying to show us something," he said quietly, though his eyes never left the towering figure ahead. Two younger men hurried forward to join him, their hesitation overridden by the gravity in his voice. Together, they moved across the dew-damp field, the grass whispering around their legs as the elephant began to walk in earnest. Despite its size, it traveled with surprising silence, each step deliberate but unhurried, as though mindful of the fragile hope now trailing behind it. The path sloped gradually downward toward a stretch of broken earth where recent rains had softened the ground. Before long, Elias noticed impressions scattered through the mud, small, uneven marks partially blurred by water, but still visible if one looked closely enough. Footprints, not animal, human and small. His pulse quickened. They followed the trail as it threaded toward a narrow ravine, choked with brush. Branches were snapped there, leaves crushed flat, the subtle chaos of something having passed through too quickly. Then one of the men stopped abruptly and pointed. Half hidden among the weeds lay a bright scrap of fabric, its color jarringly out of place against the muted greens and browns of the wild. Elias bent to retrieve it, his breath catching when he recognized the soft, patterned cloth. The torn edge of what could only have been a child's garment, a hush fell over them. The elephant had halted near the ravine's edge now, its trunk lowered, its posture alert but calm, a silent guardian standing watch. Elias approached carefully and looked down into the shallow drop below. There, at the base where rainwater had once rushed through, the earth was pressed into the shape of recent disturbance, and from somewhere just beyond the tangle of fallen branches came the faintest sound, so fragile it might have been mistaken for the wind. A whimper. Elias's heart lurched. He did not hesitate, pushing through the brush. Heedless of the thorns catching at his sleeves, he followed the sound until the branches opened into a small hollow sheltered from view. And there, curled weakly against the roots of an old tree, lay a child, mud-streaked, trembling but unmistakably alive. For a moment, relief struck so sharply it almost stole his strength. Behind him, the elephant released a deep, rolling rumble that seemed to vibrate with quiet assurance, as if to say, "Here, this is why I came." Elias dropped to his knees beside the child, the world narrowing to the fragile rise and fall of a small chest beneath layers of dirt-streaked fabric. Up close, the child looked impossibly young, no more than 5 or 6, with tangled hair clinging damply to a pale forehead and lashes heavy with exhaustion. For one terrifying instant, Elias feared they had arrived too late. Then the child stirred weakly, a shallow breath trembling free, followed by another faint whimper that carried more life than any shout ever could. "Easy. You're safe now," Elias whispered, though he was not sure the child could hear him. He slipped off his coat without hesitation and wrapped it gently around the tiny shoulders, surprised by how cold the small body felt, even beneath the growing warmth of morning. The ground here remained shaded and damp, sheltered from sunlight, a place where night's chill lingered long after dawn. Carefully, he brushed mud away from the child's cheek, searching for signs of injury. There were scratches along the arms, a bruise darkening near the temple, but no wound that spoke of immediate danger. It looked less like the aftermath of violence and more like the cruel result of being lost, alone, and exposed to the elements. Behind him, one of the men exhaled shakily. How long could they have been here? Elias did not answer. His gaze had shifted toward the rim of the hollow, where the elephant still stood above them, vast against the brightening sky. Only now did the scene arrange itself clearly in his mind. The careful way branches near the child had been pushed aside rather than crushed, the wide, unmistakable prints circling the area, the absence of predator tracks. Understanding moved through him slowly but with undeniable certainty. The elephant had found the child, and it had stayed, perhaps through the cold hours of darkness, perhaps longer, guarding, waiting. When Elias lifted the child gently into his arms, the small head tipped instinctively toward his chest, seeking warmth. A faint murmur escaped parted lips. Not words, just the fragile sound of someone drifting at the edge of consciousness. Relief swept through him, deep enough to make his eyes sting. "We must get back. Now," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. The climb out of the hollow felt longer than it should have, every step measured, protective. As soon as Elias reached level ground, the elephant moved, not forward, not away, but alongside, matching their pace with quiet vigilance. Villagers approaching from the field froze at the sight, the old man carrying a rescued child, while the enormous animal walked near like a silent escort. No one spoke. Awe held them still. Near the edge of the village, a woman suddenly cried out, the sound breaking into the morning like shattering glass. She ran forward, recognition flooding her face before she even reached them. "My son!" Her voice collapsed into a sob as she gathered the child carefully from Elias's arms, pressing trembling kisses against a mud-streaked brow. The child stirred again, stronger this time, and a collective breath seemed to release from everyone at once. Elias stepped back, his heart still racing, and turned toward the elephant. For a long moment neither moved. Gratitude felt too small for what stood before him, this being that had crossed distance and time, that had remembered kindness and answered it not with instinct alone, but with something far deeper. Slowly, Elias approached and placed his weathered hand against the elephant's trunk. The skin was warm, solid, alive beneath his touch, just as it had been years ago. The elephant responded at once, curling its trunk gently around his forearm, the gesture careful enough to make his breath catch, and in that quiet contact, Elias understood something with absolute clarity. 12 years ago, he had saved a life. Today, that life had returned the gift. For a long moment, after the child was carried safely into the arms of waiting villagers, no one seemed willing to break the silence that had settled over the field. Relief still trembled in the air, raw and overwhelming. Yet beneath it flowed something deeper, a shared awareness that they had just witnessed an act no one would ever fully be able to explain. The mother's quiet sobs drifted from the distance as neighbors gathered around her, their voices soft with disbelief and gratitude. But Elias remained where he was, standing only a few steps from the elephant, feeling as though the world beyond that space had faded into gentle irrelevance. The morning sun had climbed higher now, pouring warm light across the land, and in it the elephant appeared almost timeless, a creature belonging not merely to the forest behind it, but to something older, something woven into the memory of the earth itself. Elias rested his palm against the curve of its trunk, and the familiar texture beneath his skin carried him back across the years in a single heartbeat. How strange, he thought, that time could stretch so wide between two moments, and yet fold closed again, as if no distance had ever existed. "You remembered the way back," he said softly. The elephant's eye regarded him with that same quiet intelligence, unhurried, steady. There was no need for human understanding in it, no demand to be interpreted, and yet Elias felt certain, with the kind of certainty that lives beyond logic, that the animal had not arrived here by chance. Somewhere in the unseen workings of memory, kindness had endured. He became aware then of how differently the story might have ended. Without the elephant, the child might have remained hidden in that hollow until strength gave way entirely. Night creatures would have passed near, cold would have tightened its grip. Hope might have slipped silently away before anyone even knew to search. The thought sent a faint chill through him, despite the growing warmth of day. Around them, villagers watched with reverent stillness. Fear had long since vanished from their expressions, replaced by awe and perhaps a quiet humility. They had seen strength choose compassion, had seen the wild carry mercy back to the human world. After a while, the elephant shifted its weight, not restlessly, not with impatience, simply the subtle movement of something aware that its purpose here was drawing to a close. It lifted its trunk once more, brushing it lightly against Elias's shoulder, in a gesture so reminiscent of the past that his chest tightened. Instinctively, he raised his hand higher, pressing it gently against the broad plane of the animal's forehead. "Go on," he murmured, though part of him wished the moment could remain suspended forever. "The forest is waiting." The elephant lingered one heartbeat longer, then turned. Each step away felt both enormous and impossibly quiet, the grass bending beneath its passage. Sunlight traced along its back as it moved toward the distant tree line, the same path, or one very much like it, that had once carried a wounded young creature back into the wild. Only now it walked with the confidence of years, with strength fully claimed. Halfway across the field, it paused. Slowly, it looked back. Elias felt the familiar ache return, gentler this time, threaded with gratitude rather than loss. He lifted his hand in a small, wordless farewell. No promises were needed between them. Whatever bound their lives had already proven itself stronger than time, stronger than distance. Then the elephant released a deep, resonant rumble that rolled softly through the morning air, a sound felt more than heard, before continuing on. Step by step, the vast shape grew smaller, merging at last with the green hush of the forest, until only shifting leaves marked where it had passed. Life gradually resumed its motion around the village, yet something subtle had changed. People would speak of this morning for years, not simply as the day a child was saved, but as the day they were reminded that compassion does not disappear into the past. It travels, it waits, and sometimes, when least expected, it finds its way home again. Elias remained standing in the sunlight long after the forest had swallowed the final trace of grey. His heart felt strangely light, as though a circle he had never known was open had finally closed. Some debts are never spoken aloud, yet in the quiet language shared between living beings, in memory, in mercy, in the courage to step toward another life when fear says step away, they are always somehow repaid.